The summer of 1987 in Texas was a furnace, the air thick with heat that clung to the skin like a second layer. The kind of heat that made even the hardiest souls in Huntsville's maximum security prison wilt under its weight. Inside the concrete walls of the Allenby Polunsky Unit, where the state housed its death row inmates, the atmosphere was heavier still, a mix of despair, resignation, and the faint hum of a system that had long since stopped asking questions. In the midst of this purgatory sat Jack Turner, a 58-year-old man whose name had once been whispered in the small town of Lubbock as a cautionary tale. A man convicted of a brutal double murder. He'd always claimed he didn't commit. Jack was a loner, his gray eyes hardened by 30 years behind bars. His once broad shoulders now stooped under the weight of time, and a sentence that had stripped him of everything. Everything except one friend, the only light in his dark world. A scruffy German shepherd named Max. Jack had found Max as a pup 15 years ago, back when he was still at a lower security facility. A stray that had wandered into the prison yard during a rare outdoor recreation hour. The guards had let him keep the dog, a small mercy in a place devoid of kindness. And Max had become his shadow, his confidant, the one soul who never judged him, who saw past the orange jumpsuit to the man beneath. But when Jack was transferred to death row 5 years ago, Max had been taken away, sent to a local shelter, a separation that had broken Jack's heart more than any court ruling ever could. Now, as the clock ticked down to his final hours, his execution scheduled for 6. On a swelteringly unbearable July evening, a question lingered in the air, spoken in a voice that trembled with the weight of its own inevitability. If your last day on earth arrived, what would you wish for most? For Jack Turner, the answer was simple. And it wasn't freedom, or a last meal, or a chance to say goodbye to the family he'd lost touch with decades ago. It was Max, the only friend who'd ever truly known him. The one he longed to see one last time before the state of Texas took his life. The morning of Jack's execution dawned with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls of the prison, the air thick with the scent of bleach and the distant clang of metal doors. Jack sat on the edge of his bunk in his 6x9 cell, his hands clasped between his knees, his gray hair thinning, his face etched with lines that told the story of a life marked by hardship, long before the law had branded him a monster. He'd been on death row for 5 years, each day a slow march toward this moment. But he'd never begged for mercy, never shed a tear, never let the guards see the fear that gnawed at him in the dead of night. Jack Turner was a man who'd learned to survive by shutting down, by building walls around his heart that no one, not the other inmates, not the guards, not even the chaplain who'd visited him that morning could breach. But as the clock ticked closer to 6, as the guards prepared the execution chamber, with a clinical precision that made his stomach churn, Jack allowed himself one vulnerability, one final request that he whispered to the warden during his last meeting in the visitation room. "I don't want a steak, or a preacher, or a letter to my sister," he said, his voice rough but steady, his eyes fixed on the table between them. "I just want to see Max, my dog, one last time." The warden, a stern man named Harold Grayson, with a face like weathered granite, blinked in surprise, his brow furrowing at the unusual request. In his 20 years at Polunsky, he'd heard inmates ask for everything from cigarettes to a phone call to their mother. But a dog, that was a first. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. As Grayson weighed the request, protocol didn't allow for such things. Pets weren't part of the death row handbook. But there was something in Jack's eyes, a raw, unspoken plea that cut through the warden's usual indifference. Grayson had seen Jack's file, knew the man had been a model prisoner despite his sentence, knew he'd never caused trouble, never lashed out, never given them a reason to tighten the leash. And maybe it was the heat, or the weight of sending another man to his death. But Grayson found himself nodding, his voice gruff as he spoke. "I'll see what I can do," he said. And with that, a flicker of hope ignited in Jack's chest. a hope he hadn't felt in years. A hope that carried him through the final hours as he waited for the one friend who'd never abandoned him. The clock read 4:30 when the heavy steel door of the visitation room creaked open, the sound echoing through the sterile space like a gunshot in the quiet. Jack sat at the metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his orange jumpsuit stark against the gray walls, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He'd been waiting for this moment since the warden's promise, every second stretching into an eternity, every creak of the prison making him jump, hoping, praying that Max would come. And then he heard it, a faint jingle, the sound of a collar, followed by the soft patter of paws on the concrete floor. Max appeared in the doorway, led by a young guard named Tommy, a rookie who'd volunteered to pick the dog up from the shelter after Grayson had tracked him down. Max was older now, his muzzle gray, his gait slower than Jack remembered. But those amber eyes, those eyes that had once looked at Jack with unwavering trust, lit up the moment they landed on him. Jack's breath caught in his throat, a sob breaking free as he slid off the chair and onto his knees, his cuffed hands reaching out as Max bounded forward, his tail wagging furiously despite his age, his body trembling with joy as he leapt into Jack's arms. "Max," Jack whispered, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The first tears he'd shed in 30 years. A flood of emotion he couldn't hold back as he buried his face in Max's fur. The familiar scent of dust and warmth. A lifeline in a world that had taken everything else. Max whimpered, licking Jack's face, his body pressing close as if he could erase the years of separation with sheer will, as if he knew this might be their last moment together. The guards in the room, Tommy, Grayson, and a third man named Ellis, a veteran officer with a permanent scowl, stood in silence, their faces a mix of discomfort and awe, as they watched a man on the brink of death find a piece of his soul in the embrace of a dog. For Jack, it was a moment of pure, unfiltered love. A reunion that made the looming specter of the execution chamber fade into the background, if only for a little while. But that moment of peace was about to be shattered in a way no one could have predicted, setting off a chain of events that would rewrite Jack's story in its final chapters. As Jack held Max close, whispering words of love and gratitude into the dog's ear, something shifted, a subtle change that only Max could sense. The German shepherd's body tensed, his ears pricking, his nose twitching as he pulled back from Jack, his amber eyes narrowing as he sniffed the air around his owner. Then, without warning, Max began to bark, a deep, ferocious sound that reverberated through the visitation room, his hackles rising, his body lowering into a protective stance as he turned toward Officer Ellis, the veteran guard standing near the door. Max's barks turned to growls, his teeth bared, his eyes locked on Ellis with an intensity that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Jack looked up, confusion etched on his tear-streaked face, his hands still tangled in Max's fur. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" he asked, his voice trembling. But Max didn't stop. He lunged forward, straining against Jack's hold, his growls growing louder, more insistent, as if he were trying to tell them something no one else could see. The guards reacted instinctively, Tommy stepping forward to grab Max's collar, but Grayson raised a hand, his brow furrowing as he watched the dog, then glanced at Ellis, whose face had gone pale, his hands twitching at his sides. "What's got him so riled up?" Grayson asked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ellis, who was now sweating, his usual scowl replaced by a look of barely concealed panic. "He's just a dog. He doesn't know what he's doing," Ellis snapped, his voice too quick, too defensive. But Max's growls didn't falter. He kept barking, his body trembling with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep, somewhere primal. Jack, still on his knees, looked between Max and Ellis, a flicker of realization dawning in his eyes, a memory from decades ago, resurfacing like a ghost he'd tried to bury. He knows something, Jack said softly, his voice steady now, his gaze locking onto Ellis with a clarity that hadn't been there in years. He's trying to tell us something. Grayson, a man who'd seen enough in his career to trust his gut, ordered a search of Ellis's belongings, a decision that would unravel a web of corruption and lies that had kept Jack on death row for 3 decades. What they found in Ellis's locker, a hidden file, a forged witness statement, a letter implicating him in a cover-up, would change everything, setting the stage for a fight for justice that no one saw coming, least of all the man who'd been prepared to die just hours before. The discovery of the evidence in Ellis's locker sent shockwaves through the prison, a ripple that turned into a tidal wave, as Grayson called in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to investigate. The file contained a confession from a man named Roy Baxter, a small-time crook who'd been the real killer in the 1957 double murder. Jack had been convicted of a confession that Ellis, then a rookie cop, had buried to protect Baxter, his cousin, and to close a case that had made his career. The letter detailed how Ellis had coerced a witness, a young woman named Clara Evans, into falsifying her testimony against Jack, threatening her with jail time if she didn't comply. Clara had since passed away, but the letter included dates, names, and details that matched Jack's own account. A story he told at his trial. A story no one had believed, because Ellis had ensured the evidence pointed only to Jack. The revelation was a bombshell, one that halted Jack's execution just 45 minutes before he was set to walk to the chamber. The warden's hands shaking as he signed the stay of execution, his voice hoarse as he muttered, "We've got a problem." Jack was moved back to his cell, Max at his side, the dog's presence. A quiet comfort as the prison buzzed with activity. Investigators, lawyers, even reporters who'd caught wind of the story and were now camped outside the gates, their cameras flashing in the humid night air. For Jack, the next 2 weeks were a blur of tension and uncertainty, his life hanging in the balance as the state reopened his case, a process that should have brought hope, but instead brought a new kind of torment. He sat in his cell, Max curled up at his feet, the dog's warmth, a reminder of the life he might still have. But the weight of 30 years in prison bore down on him, his body frail from years of poor nutrition and stress, his mind battered by the constant fear of death. He'd been so close to the end, so close to giving up, and now he was being asked to hope again, to believe in a system that had failed him so spectacularly. The guards watched him closely, some with pity, others with suspicion, while the investigation unfolded. Each new piece of evidence, a nail in the coffin of the lie that had stolen 3 decades of Jack's life. Max, sensing Jack's unease, stayed close, his amber eyes soft but vigilant, his presence a silent promise that he wouldn't let Jack face this alone. And Jack, for the first time in years, allowed himself to dream of freedom, of fresh air, of a life where he and Max could sit under the stars, without bars between them and the sky. After 2 weeks of relentless investigation, the truth came to light, a truth that shook the Texas justice system to its core. On a swelteringly unbearable August morning, the state officially exonerated Jack Turner, overturning his conviction in a hearing that made national headlines. The real killer, Roy Baxter, had died in a bar fight in 1972, but the evidence against him, DNA from the crime scene, matched years later when technology caught up. Combined with the confession Ellis had hidden was undeniable. Jack had been framed, his life stolen by a corrupt cop who'd built his career on a lie. A cop who was now facing charges of his own obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and perjury, crimes that would likely send him to the same prison where he'd once guarded Jack. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Jack, who sat in the courtroom as the judge read the ruling, his hands clasped in his lap, Max lying at his feet, the dog's presence. A quiet anchor in a moment that felt surreal. "You're a free man, Mr. Turner," the judge said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what had been done. And for the first time in 30 years, Jack allowed himself to believe it. But freedom came at a cost. Jack's health had deteriorated during his decades in prison, his body weakened by malnutrition, stress, and the toll of living under a death sentence. He left Polunsky that day a free man, but a frail one, his steps slow, his hands trembling as he walked out into the Texas sun. Max trotting beside him, the dog's tail wagging softly, his amber eyes bright with a joy that mirrored Jack's own. The media frenzy was overwhelming reporters, shouting questions, cameras flashing, but Jack ignored them. His focus on the horizon, on the promise of a life he thought he'd never see again. He moved to a small cabin in the Texas Hill Country, a quiet place where the air smelled of cedar and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets. A gift from a local pastor who'd followed his story and wanted to give him a fresh start. There, Jack and Max spent their days in peace, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the rolling hills. Jack's hand resting on Max's head, the dog's warmth, a reminder of the miracle that had brought them back together. Max was old now, his muzzle fully gray, his movements slow, but he never left Jack's side. A loyal friend to the end. A friend who'd saved his life with a bark that had spoken louder than any lawyer ever could. In the quiet of those final years, as Jack watched the stars from his porch, Max snoring softly at his feet, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the years of despair, the moments of hope, the dog who'd never given up on him. Even when the world had, Jack Turner had been a man marked for death, a man the system had tried to erase. But Max had seen the truth, had fought for him in a way no human ever had. His loyalty, a beacon that had cut through the darkness of a corrupt justice system. The lesson was clear, etched into the lines of Jack's face, into the gentle wag of Max's tail. Sometimes, the purest loyalty is wiser than any human courtroom. A truth that can right the greatest wrongs, that can bring light to the darkest places. Jack lived out his days in that cabin, his health too fragile for long walks or grand adventures. But he didn't need them. He had Max, and that was enough. When Max passed away 2 years later, at the ripe old age of 17, Jack buried him under a cedar tree on the property, a small wooden cross marking the spot, the words, "My hero," carved into the wood with a shaky hand. Jack followed him a year later, his body finally giving out. But he died a free man, a man who'd known love, who'd known loyalty, who'd known the kind of justice that only a dog's heart can deliver. Their story became a legend in Texas, a testament to the power of instinct, of love, of the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. A story that asks us all to consider the moments when we felt a truth no one else could see, when we've trusted a feeling over a system, when we've fought for what's right against all odds. So, as you think about Jack and Max, as you imagine the stars over that quiet cabin in the hill country, I leave you with this question. Do you believe that the purest instincts can change a person's fate? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story, to know what you'd hold on to if the world turned against you, and who you trust to lead you back to the light.